America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation. And today we're joined by Spencer Morrison. Spencer is the author of ReSure, How Tariffs Will Bring Our Jobs Home and Revive the American Dream, and the editor-in-chief of the National Economics Editorial. Spencer, thanks for joining us on Main Street Matters.
Elaine, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on your book. I think it's a perfect topic to be talking about right now. I know I've mentioned to a few people that I'm pretty confident that most Americans have lived their entire life not thinking about tariffs a single time, not thinking about how they affect the price of anything, not thinking about the policy, and suddenly it is the topic at kitchen tables around the country. I think because President Trump has a tariff policy, and that's probably the only reason. So I thought this would be a great conversation for us to really kind of start at ground zero on like how we got here. Like, you know, we have a trade deficit. We've had a trade deficit for, you know, generations. How did we get here? Why?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and you're entirely right. So America's run a trade deficit every single year since 1974. 1974. And we're not talking about small deficits either. I mean, this thing is large. If you do the math and you look at, the trade deficit over time, what's the cumulative value of the trade deficit? And then, of course, you adjust for inflation. We're looking at about $28 trillion that's left the country, buying the future that we should have been building. It's a tremendous amount of money. That's like an entire year's worth of GDP. On top of that, there's other ways that money flows out of the country, of course. Foreign direct investment is another way that happens. So when an American company offshores a factory, of course, they got to pay for the factory in China, right? They're putting that money into the country. They're typically upgrading the infrastructure. They might be building a port or upgrading the roads. It's a lot of money as well. We're talking a couple of trillion, at least $2 trillion. It's hard to figure out the exact value of that because so much money sort of flows through, the British Virgin Islands and these sort of other other ways into China, right? So it's very difficult to find out exactly what the value of that is, but it's at least $2 trillion. And then on top of that, I mean, you have intellectual property. When an American factory, and people don't understand this, but when an American factory moves to China, they have to do a joint venture with a Chinese company. So on the ground, there's actually a Chinese partner company that does actually all of the on-the-ground work. So we have to send them the machinery. We train their people up on the machinery. We give them the technology so that they can replicate it. And then, of course, what happens? We've given them all the technology, right? And that's a necessary step to doing business in China. And the value of that, it's unquantifiable, but just in terms of sort of counterfeiting and economic espionage, we're talking about $9.9 trillion since 2001. So all of this is the long way of saying that there's been a tremendous amount of money that's left the country over the last 40 years, especially over the last 20 years. And this has had really, really bad impacts for the American worker, American small businesses, and of course, the American people at large.
Yeah, and that intellectual property, I think people really don't understand that piece of it either because they literally steal our stuff. You know, they steal that intellectual property, then they make it themselves, and then they sell it back to the American people for cheaper and undercut the original manufacturer of the product. And it's so disgusting. And there's little to no recourse, right, on the intellectual property stuff.
Nothing that can be done. American companies aren't going to be protected in Chinese courts. It's just not the way it works, right? So, right. Yeah, I mean, it's horrible. So Chinese companies have basically a carte blanche to steal American technology, sell it back to us at a discounted rate, put the Americans out of business, and then, of course, Do they reciprocate? Can we access their market? No, not really. There's very little American market penetration in China. Pretty much everything that's sold in China is made in China, right? Because they have, and this brings us to tariffs. China's got, traditionally, they have high tariffs. More importantly, they have non-tariff barriers to entry to the market. So this is part of the problem that President Trump is trying to address with the tariffs.
And he interestingly, I've seen so many really old videos of him before he ever ran for office. He's just been completely consistent for like 30 years talking on this issue. You will not find him deviate from his message on this. He just continues to be consistent. How did NAFTA play into this as well, and sort of taking a system that was broken and I mean, breaking it even more, because NAFTA was under Bill Clinton, and it was billed to the American people as something that was just so great. But my brother-in-law is a welder in a union, and I can remember him back then saying, "This is not good. This is not going to be good for us." And now, in retrospect, a lot of people understand that it wasn't good, and that we lost a lot of manufacturing jobs because of it.
Yeah, NAFTA was sort of the appetizer for what was to come with China. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. NAFTA is, of course, a decade before that. And just so everybody understands what NAFTA was, it's a North American Free Trade Agreement. It was a so-called free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Now, in fairness, was it a free trade agreement or was it a managed trade agreement? You know, there's debate on either way. But really, the ultimate problem with NAFTA is that what it was doing is it was sort of coalescing three very different countries with very different economies into one sort of super economic structure. And of course, this causes all sorts of economic dislocation, particularly with Mexico, right? And you think about just some of the cost of doing business in a country like Mexico versus America. Labor is a lot cheaper in Mexico. The business culture is very different in Mexico. I mean, Mexico runs, frankly, if you want to speak honestly, Mexico runs on bribes, right? I know people that do business down there. It's a very different sort of business and legal culture in Mexico. Their environmental laws, very different. Standards, regulations, very different. So the problem is that when you sort of try to integrate a first world developed economy like America with a developing economy like Mexico, you can't have free trade. You just can't, because the price of doing business is very, very different, which basically pits American workers in direct competition with Mexican workers who are earning like 10 cents on the dollar. So how is America's labor market going to recover? It's not. And this is why NAFTA led to over 800,000 manufacturing jobs in the States disappearing. And then on top of that, all of the service jobs that were predicated on that. And, your audience is going to be aware of this. And, I just want to make the point of saying that there's sort of two different types of industries, okay? There's something called an anchor industry, and then there's the predicate industries. So the anchor industry is like a farm or a mine or a factory. It brings wealth into a community. It generates material wealth. And then on top of that, you have these predicate industries. These are like services like barbers, lawyers, doctors, dentists, things like that. You don't have a town ever springing up around a lawyer's office. You do have towns springing up around factories, right? You can't put the cart before the horse. The factory comes first, because that's what you build a community around. You build it around production. And what happened with NAFTA is all of these anchor industries went over to Mexico. And then after 2001 with China, they started going to China. 60,000 factories left since 2001 to China. So you don't just lose the factory and the 5 million jobs since 2001. You lose all the jobs that it supported. You have whole communities dying off, right? Because you're not going to have a healthy town life with, like a thriving Main Street if there's no wealth flowing into the community. The whole community shrivels and dies.
And the youth leaves because there's no jobs. And
they got to get out. Where are they going to go?
Exactly.
People need to work. And this has caused huge amounts of economic dislocation in the Rust Belt. And this has led to all sorts of social problems. I mean, we look at the opioid epidemic. We look at, the number of people claiming disabilities and receiving Social Security. These are all going up, particularly in areas that were hit hardest by offshoring. The jobs dry up. People, their lives collapse. and people
Mhm.
respond to that in different, usually negative ways.
So help us understand Trump 1.0, his first term, because I don't think there was as big a focus on the first term and what he did in terms of tariffs. But we've talked, I've heard a lot of people talk about it in retrospect that not only did they work, but they worked so well that the Biden administration kept them. So talk to us about what he did there, and then we'll move into what his strategy is now.
Yeah, so Trump 1.0 um, was in a lot of ways a very effective presidency. It was also somewhat a disorganized presidency. And I think really the big difference between 2016 and of course now is that when President Trump came into power this time around, the executive orders for tariffs were crisp. They were all ready to go. They were grounded in established law. They weren't sort of figuring out on the fly, and that's why we've seen everything jump into action right away this time. And I think they've done a really amazing job getting the tariffs on the table this time around. Not so much last time. There were some targeted tariffs, of course, on steel and aluminum, and they were effective. Um, the difference is that now we're seeing sort of a broad-based tariff policy that doesn't just focus on industrial products. We're talking about just about everything that we import into the country. So there's a big difference. The tariffs that are being imposed now are a lot more totalizing. So they're going to have a bigger effect on reshoring industry in general, as opposed to specific strategic industries.
And so first, I agree with you. I think everything about this second administration, second term, has been super targeted across many different policy areas. It's like he spent 4 years preparing all of these executive orders, all of these strategies, and he came in on day one and just hit a button and everything went. Because the speed at which the administration has moved is, I mean, it's crazy fast. It's like, we talk about the speed of government or the speed of business. This is like the speed of Trump, and
It's almost like he's done before, right?
yeah, it's amazing how fast he's moved, which is good because there's so many organizations and the other side is out there constantly trying to put barricades up into him moving forward. And I think he's got so many he's moving so many marbles in the sand at the same time that they can't stop them all, thankfully, so we can get something done. But you argue in your book that tariffs are essential for rebuilding American industry. How do you respond to critics who just say this is just a tax on consumers? I mean, we saw Amazon, I think it was Amazon, was going to like list a line item on there, like, this is your tariff tax on the new product. Um, we won't talk about the politics of that, but just it's so insulting.
Why didn't they just put a Buy American sticker on?
Right.
They could have done that. They could have told people how to buy American. Instead, they're prioritizing Chinese goods.
Yes, exactly. But how do you respond to critics who say it's just a tax on your products?
Well, it's a bit of it. So what they're doing is duplicitous. I mean, tariffs are obviously a tax. Everybody's aware of that. The government is instituting you got to pay something on top of the price of something. So it's obviously a tax, but that's not really the effect or the purpose of tariffs. So, I mean, it depends what you're doing. So if we just walk through the economic history a little bit, you got to indulge me. So the first major piece of legislation was the Tariff Act of 1789. And there was two reasons for that. It was a dual purpose act. The first reason was to raise some revenue because obviously the new government needs money. The second point of it, though, and this is actually the more important purpose, it was designed to industrialize America, explicitly to industrialize America. And you got to remember, this is around the time that Alexander Hamilton is writing his report on manufactures. This is right after the Revolution. George Washington and the other founding fathers have realized that, hey, this almost didn't get off the ground if it weren't for France providing us with 80,000 firearms, swords, cannon, everything that we need, right? Because America couldn't make the stuff that was required to actually get the revolution off the ground. All of that was gifted from different European powers. And this was a huge problem for the founding fathers, because they said, look, this is not going to be an independent country for very long if we can't even manufacture firearms. Like, it's just not going to happen. So the point of tariffs was to keep European products out and to create a market for American manufacturing. And this set up an economic paradigm that was sort of called the American system, whereby the American domestic market was protected. American manufacturers, had a built-in market in the colonies for their goods. And it was under this system that America industrialized and became the world's leading industrial power. Throughout the 1800s, America had the highest tariff rate in the world. Tariff rate was over 30% on average. And this is at a time like before container ships, right? Mm-hmm. So the tariff rate was high, highest in the world. It wasn't until America already had established its manufacturing supremacy that the tariffs came down, in particular after World War II, this thing called the Marshall Plan. Everybody's heard of the Marshall Plan. It was this, the point was to rebuild Western Europe, right? And part of the Marshall Plan was taking the tariff rates in Europe down so that they could sell their goods here, build up their market, but their markets were going to remain protected so that they could redevelop. And here we are, 3 generations later, and we're still doing the Marshall Plan, essentially. And not only that, but we're doing the Marshall Plan for the whole world, right? This plan has been exported to China. This plan was exported to places in Africa, India. Essentially, everybody has had access to America's market. And that, of course, brings us to where we are today, where you have all these asymmetrical trade relationships between the developing world and America. And it's causing a whole lot of economic problems here. So that's your sort of brief economic history as to why we had tariffs in the first place. And to circle back to the original question, are tariffs a tax? What are they for? Yes, tariffs are a tax. Nobody denies that. But the purpose of them is not necessarily to raise revenue. The purpose is to make sure that the domestic production remains where it is. America's factories got to remain in America. And I'll tell you what, if you're buying American, you're not going to pay any tariffs at all, right? So that's the point. The point is not to raise as much revenue as possible. The point is to bring the jobs home so that you're not paying any of those tariffs at all, right? We want the industry here. We want the jobs here. Because the government's going to get its money either way. They're going to get it through income tax, through, right, GDP growth. That's a much better way of getting the money than, than the tariffs, right? What we want to do is we want to grow the economy and increase the size of the pot, right? And that's what tariffs are all about.
So if we increase our tariffs on countries that are exporting to us, and we raise it to the point where it's essentially too expensive, right, to bring the outside goods in, that our companies who are here will start bringing their products home, making them here, or building factories to make them here, hence creating jobs. And so if you don't buy outside of the country, you're not paying any tariffs. I saw an interview with Whirlpool the other day, the CEO. I did not know this, all of their appliances are made in the US. So it's not affecting them at all.
And I think that's really important to remember. So there's a lot of American manufacturing. America makes just about everything, but we don't make, necessarily the mass market goods in everything. Like if you want to buy shoes, you can buy American-made shoes. They're going to be like the high-end shoes. But these companies have the capacity to just increase production and make a cheaper mass market product. The reason they don't is because they're being outcompeted by, essentially slave labor in China.
Right.
But the capacity to make those goods, by and large, is already here. I've been talking to manufacturers, all across the country, and what they're basically telling me is that most of them have excess capacity. They could increase the production volume. In some cases, they've been telling me, look, we're at 60% capacity right now. We could increase capacity by 40%. We already have all the equipment that we need to do that. The only thing we don't have is the market, right? And of course, when you're dealing with manufactured goods, The beautiful thing is that you have this thing called the law of increasing returns, which means
Mhm.
the more product you make, the cheaper each unit is actually to create as well, right? Because you have these big fixed costs in your factory and your land, but the ongoing costs to make a manufactured good are just about the same whether you're making it in Mexico or America or China, right? There's not a huge difference in ongoing production costs. Um, so one of the reasons why tariffs isn't going to increase the cost of goods is, first of all, any manufactured any good that's made in America isn't going to go up in price. Second, the per unit cost of goods that are manufactured in the States are going to go down. And then third, when people have jobs, they have more income, more purchasing power. So what we'd like to see is, an increase in jobs, an increase in wages, is going to more than offset um, the, a potential increase in price.
So, from the moment Trump came in and started with the tariffs, we saw some back and forth with countries on retaliatory tariffs, China, Europe, Canada. We saw some of that. We've seen a lot of that die down. And we've seen 150, maybe more now, come to the table and want to work deals. What do you think about some of the more high profile deals that have been talked about? China, they put one out on China. I think the UK. I'm not sure of some of the other big ones, but what are your thoughts on how the process is going?
I think it's going about as well as expected. I mean, here's the reality. Everybody wants access to America's market because America is the biggest consumer market in the world. So everybody wants to sell their goods here. It's no question. And they will pay to get the goods into the country, right? They'll do that. In my view, though, what I'd like to see, and this is just me speaking optimistically, I'd like to see some of these deals get rebuffed. I'd like to see the tariffs nice and high across the board, and I want to see them stable so that American businesses can bank on them and invest here in America. Um, and I'll give you one example. So the tariffs, there's a tentative deal between America and China right now. Tariffs, on the Chinese goods are going to be 55%. Um, the problem, though, is if we strike a deal, let's say with India, and let's say that the tariffs on India are maybe 10%. They're 10% right now. Let's say they stay at 10%. This is going to, the tariffs are going to be high enough on China that people aren't going to want to do business in China. The problem is that they're low enough on India that it's now cheaper to do business in India than the States, right? So those jobs are just going to move from China to India. But that's not the point. The point is to take those jobs from China and India, move them back to America. So I think we
Mhm.
have to be really, really careful about targeting and singling out certain countries, and we gotta understand that that's not the game we're playing. The point of tariffs is not to punish China, even though we might want to punish China, and they probably deserve it, right?
Right.
But that's not the point. The point's not to punish China. The point is to support American industry and make America rich again. So we have to have the tariffs across the board. If we're going to put tariffs on China, they got to be on India, they got to be on Vietnam, they got to be on all these developing countries. Because otherwise, we're going to have a patchwork quilt of different tariff rates across the world, and it's just going to relocate production to different developing countries. We don't want
You
to
just
play shuffleboard. We want to bring it. We want the jobs, right?
Yeah, you're just shifting the problem from one country to another,
Yeah, we don't
basically.
need India to be China 2.0. There's no
Right,
point in that.
right. And so there were a lot of doomsdayers who said, naysayers who said, oh, we're going to have inflation. We're going to bring back inflation big time. I mean, the Fed is literally the joke I heard yesterday from our CEO was that the Fed in 2021 and 2022 kept claiming that inflation was transitory and didn't do anything. Well, now he's claiming that no inflation is transitory and he's still not doing anything as far as lowering the rates. So he seems to be kind of late to the party on everything. He's still anticipating inflation as a result of these tariffs, and we haven't seen it. We've actually seen inflation continue to come down. And so, what is sort of your response to that, and to Americans who are sort of sitting there waiting for inflation to come?
Yeah, I mean, there's everybody talks about tariffs. They say they're going to cause inflation. This is simply not grounded in fact. I mean, if you look at the historical reality, all throughout the 1800s into the 1900s, America had the highest tariff rates in the world, and yet the cost of goods went down decade by decade by decade by decade. In fact, you look at the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, Americans were spending a higher proportion of their income on their wants versus needs than they are today,
Hmm.
right? So we've been in this sort of free trade paradigm for 50 years, and the standard of living has actually gone down for most Americans when you take technology out of the equation. Um, so tariffs are not they're not going to raise the cost of living. I mean, the deflationary periods in American history were periods where we had high tariffs, right? I mean, we want to talk about inflation. Inflation is caused by printing too much money, and one of the main reasons we're printing so much money is because there's international demand for U.S. dollars. So I just want to talk very briefly about the trade deficit and how it works, okay? Because people don't understand this.
Right.
America runs a trade deficit. Like I said, that trade deficit, the cumulative value out of it, $28 trillion. Trade deficit last year, almost $1 trillion. How did we pay for it? We didn't sell anything. We didn't sell goods. We didn't sell services. We're running a trade deficit, $920 billion. We got to pay for it somehow, though, don't we? How are we paying for it? There's only two things we can do. We can sell assets, so value that we made in the past, or you can sell debt, the promise to make value in the future. So we're selling off lots and lots of real estate. $40 to $50 billion of residential real estate a year, $10 billion in farmland, the balance commercial real estate. On top of that, stocks. You sell ownership in American companies to pay for the
Hmm.
trade deficit. That's why 17% of American equities are foreign owned. And then debt. Foreigners buy up American debt, right? So this is how we pay for the trade deficit. And this is called the balance of payments. So what happens is that we buy foreign goods, the money comes back, it's plugged into Wall Street through the real estate, through the stocks, and through the bonds. That's how the balance of payment works. So that also causes inflation. So you think about, so you're having this inflation either way. But the problem is that when we're running the trade deficit, the cost of housing is going up, right? It's making the cost, it's increasing the cost of your debt, right? So on the one hand, under the so-called free trade paradigm, you can have cheap spatulas, but you got an expensive house. Under tariffs, maybe the spatulas are a little more expensive, but guess what? There's not going to be all this foreign pressure to buy houses. Housing costs are going to go down, right? So inflation is balanced out either way. The whole thing is a ridiculous question, right? The question is, what is the price? Where's the money flowing, right? Under
Hmm.
the current paradigm, the money's flowing into houses, and this is why Americans can't afford houses anymore. I don't know about you, but I'd rather have an affordable house than than Polly Pocket toys from China.
Yes, I agree. I agree because housing is just out of reach for young people right now,
Yeah.
for sure. Beyond the tariffs, what else needs to happen to truly reshore manufacturing? Because that's the key: is to reshore manufacturing, create those good paying jobs here in America, and and it's not about isolationism. Like I'm tired of hearing people talk about this is an isolationist mentality. This is about protecting our country. I mean, it goes to national security, it goes to our financial security. All of those things are all wrapped up together. Is having a strong economy, it means having strong security, national security. So what else needs to happen to reshore that American manufacturing?
Well, tariffs are a great start. It's an 80-20 principle thing. I think if you do the tariffs, that's your biggest bang for your buck. You're going to get outsized benefits from it. But there's obviously a lot of other things that we need to do. Of course, if Congress would get its act together, lower taxes, reduce regulations, that'd be amazing. I don't know if we should bank on it, but one thing that I think also really ought to happen: uh, energy costs, the price of energy.
Hmm.
You gotta lower the price of energy. The price of energy in China, for example, is 20 to 40% lower than it is in America, and the big reason for that is because they allow, they're allowed to use coal, right? Um, so I think lowering the cost of energy would certainly help American business, especially because manufacturing in particular is a very energy intensive
Right.
industry, right? So lowering the cost of energy is a big one. So pipelines from the Alberta oil sands allow the production of more coal plants. LNG, let's invest in that. And all of these sort of green energy schemes, we got to stop subsidizing them. If they're not going to make money on their own, they're not worth it, right? This is why you
I
see all these,
agree.
you see all these windmills popping up and everything, and they say, oh, they're really cheap. Well, they're cheap because the government paid for them. They're not actually cheap,
Right.
right? So this is a huge problem. Um, and then infrastructure. China in the last 20 years has laid 150,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Meanwhile, America's rail has actually decreased by 10% in the same period. We have to make sure that we're up to date on our infrastructure so that we can move goods. We can move goods around, right? And part of the reason the infrastructure is dilapidated is because there's less demand for it because we're not producing the stuff here, so we don't need as much, high quality infrastructure to move things. We don't want that though. We want to build the goods here. We want to be able to move them around and get them to our people and to people around the world who want to buy them efficiently. So we got to invest in our infrastructure.
So I think you do a great job of just connecting all the dots, from energy to jobs to manufacturing to the tariffs to how they work, why they work, and how they can bring our manufacturing back and reshore the jobs. And I think that's so important since tariffs have become kitchen table discussions these days. I've one last question for you. How scared do you think the Democrats are that this is going to work?
I think they're terrified. They don't want this to work.
Right.
So I hate to say it, but the Democrats' entire the entire way that the party operates is by having dependent people vote for more welfare, ultimately,
Mhm.
right? So, offshoring, causing economic dislocation, putting people on the government dole. This manufactures Democrat voters in the same way that opening the border brings in Democrat voters, right? So, I mean, what they're doing, uh, they're supporting economic globalism because it causes economic problems, and the economic problems require a solution, right? You got to create the problem so that you can solve it. That's what the Democrats are doing by embracing this sort of free trade. And I want to be fair, though, it's not just the Democrats, just about every single Republican in Congress supports global free trade as well. Um, we really have a uniparty on this issue, and frankly, it's basically just Donald Trump standing up for the American worker.
It's interesting because he has really won over the American blue collar worker, because those same workers who, my brother in law, for instance, who were hurt by NAFTA and understand they were on the front lines of watching their jobs leave. And they, long before, I went to college, I got a degree, but long before I saw and understood what was happening, he saw it right away.
Yeah.
And for everyone, just like my brother-in-law, who, is a machinist or working in a manufacturing plant or welding or whatever it is, they were watching it firsthand and they knew it was happening and no one was doing anything for them. They just kept telling them, vote this way, vote this way, vote this way. And this election was so eye-opening because you saw so many blue collar workers, um, say, I'm done. I see a way out. I see somebody with a solution, and that's where I'm going. I'm going where the solution is, not where everyone tells me I need to vote.
Exactly. I mean, I think we love to see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Congress
Yeah.
isn't going to get it done. People got to get America First people into Congress so that they can, actually codify all of the president's executive orders and tariffs, because otherwise, uh, the whole economic agenda disappears when he leaves office.
Well, I highly recommend the book. Spencer Morrison, who is the author of ReSure, How Tariffs Will Bring Our Jobs Home and Revive the American Dream. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate the time and helping us connect the dots on this issue because it is so topical right now. So I assume we can all go buy it on Amazon or wherever you buy your books from.
Yes, ma'am. I'll just give a brief plug. Okay, so we've got a
Please.
beautiful second edition that's just come out, and it's in paperback right now. It's available on Amazon. ReSure is the blueprint to reviving the American dream and reshoring American industries. It's endorsed by the great Peter Navarro, who's out there every day fighting for the rights of American workers, and the great Steve Bannon, who was just in the White House. So there you go. Get the book. You're going to learn a lot.
Definitely, definitely. And we need to learn more about it and understand it better. Thank you again for joining us, Spencer. Thanks for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all for taking the time to tune in and listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.